everybody. Good evening and welcome to the second College Democrats and College Republicans debate of the semester. My name is Nora Walsh-Therese and I'm the president of the College Democrats. And on behalf of both clubs, I'd like to thank you all for coming out on this really disgusting rainy Thursday. I'd also like to give a special thank you to Dr. Nicholas Tampio from the Political Science Department for moderating our debate tonight. So we have 4 topics to be debated. The first 3, immigration, gun control, and entitlement reform, will follow the following format: 1.5 minutes for opening statements, 5 minutes for unstructured debate, 7 minutes for questions, and 1 minute for closing statements. And the final topic, the main event of the night, will be regarding Occupy Wall Street, and the format will be a little bit different with 2 minutes for opening statements, 5 minutes of unstructured debate, that word is getting me, 10 minutes for questions, and 1 minute for closing statements. So with that, I'd like to introduce our first topic, which will be gun control. So a new Gallup poll released yesterday shows support for gun ownership at its highest mark since the poll has been conducted. However, anti-gun groups seem to be becoming an increasingly vocal group in policymaking. Quite simply, how should U.S. gun control policy be structured? And for this, we have Sam Martin on the Republican side and Chris Bear for the Democrats.
Can you all hear me? I'd like to thank you all for coming out, first of all. I'm going to get started. I think it's time we talk about the 99%, and that is the 99% of guns that are used legally in this country. And now, it's not just 99%, it's over 99%. The number of guns used illegally in this country is drastically small. So if we want to use the rhetoric of the current Occupy Wall Street movement, their own rhetoric speaks against the fact that we should have a more lax position on guns. Now, think about this, that a gun has never killed anybody. Now, that's certainly the case, that people using guns kill people. And this is why a ban on guns will never succeed in its purpose. It attempts to quell violence. Federal and state governments have tried to take the guns out of crime. It doesn't work. You need to take the crime out of crime. The District of Columbia in 1977 imposed a draconian handgun ban that banned all handguns in the District of Columbia. And within 2 decades, their murder rate had tripled. In the years following the ban, all firearms murders were committed with handguns, which were comprehensively banned. So it's hard to see how the ban was effective. And if we look back in the last few years, the decision D.C. versus Heller from the Supreme Court, where the D.C. handgun ban was ruled unconstitutional, the murder rate in D.C. dropped 12% in 1 year after that. And that's only 1 year. And that's just staggering. So we can clearly see how legalizing guns, or legalizing legitimate ownership of guns, decreases crime. Now, there's one state that succeeds the best in this. The state with the lowest gun crime in the Union is the state of Vermont. It also has the laxest gun laws in the Union. In Vermont, any person can go to a gun store, have an instant background check, and purchase a handgun, which they may then immediately concealed carry. It's the only state like this. Now, Vermont has, by a significant margin, the lowest rate of gun crime in the nation, and you don't hear about much gun crime going on in downtown Burlington. So one has to ask, why would a state so overwhelmingly liberal choose to impose these laws? And the answer is that they know it works. And the rest of the nation needs to take a look at Vermont, see what they're doing, and start doing that, because the numbers show consistently that the more guns in a society, legal guns in a society, the lower the gun crime rate. And it's simply that the solution to gun crime is guns. People arming themselves. Because if you think about it, if you're the type of person who's going to go out and rob and murder, you're not going to obey gun laws. You already flagrantly disobey the law. Simple as that.
Okay. No, it's interesting because I think Sam was kind of anticipating me to say that we should have these draconian gun bans across the country, but that's actually not the stance I was planning on taking at all. Controversy surrounding gun ownership, the intensity of which has varied at, undoubtedly varied at different times, is one of the most immediate examples of the sort of tension that occurs when a society seeks to promote and protect individual rights while simultaneously charging its government with protecting the safety of its citizens. We have certain ideals as Americans that we frequently have to temper with pragmatism. An effort to restrict or limit the possession of a gun confronts us in a very visceral sense. Guns have long-standing cultural and symbolic significance in the United States, and has long been accepted because it is included in so many of our states' constitutions that gun ownership is a civil right, a notion that was just recently validated, as Sam mentioned, at the federal level by a Supreme Court ruling. I too am persuaded by the case for gun ownership. It appeals to me intuitively, but also morally. But I also remind myself that I don't exist in a vacuum either. Guns shouldn't just be doled out indiscriminately. Before I respond, a completely hands-off approach when it comes to gun policy, as reality would quickly remind us, simply isn't prudent. I would suggest that gun policy move forward slowly, that we urge those states that still do not require citizens to receive permits for firearms to adopt shall-issue permits, and by doing so continue to encourage those individuals that want to obtain firearms to do so and be responsible and educated on their use. Also, just I thought that maybe Sam would bring this up, but because it is so topical, in light of the recent tragedies that have happened in Tucson and elsewhere, this dialogue has come back concerning the necessity of what are called now high-capacity magazine rounds for self-defense, as contrasted with maybe their propensity to aid in acts of murder on grand scale. So I would take the stance, moving forward with gun policy, that the provision of the 1994 bill that set a limit for the clip size of ammunition that could be manufactured is worthy of a second consideration and possibly renewal.
I find it interesting you talk about the shootings in Arizona, because there's been a far more interesting application of gun law in Arizona, in that the people who have been trusted to enforce gun law in this country, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, has actually traded handguns illegally to drug cartels. So the problem isn't that we need new laws, it's that we need the laws to be enforced, and the people to enforce the laws to choose to do so, and not to flagrantly violate them on a large scale. And you seem to say that the problem is that not all states issue permits, and that every state should have to issue issue permits. But the only state in the union that does not issue gun permits is the state of Vermont, and it has the lowest gun crime rate. So why would we try to change Vermont gun law?
You know, I didn't know that about Vermont. That's a very interesting statistic. I'm not going to move backwards on the point that I think that it's a good thing that people be educated on the use of a firearm before they receive it, that someone can't just, you know, walk into a sporting goods store and pick up a firearm if they pass a 10-minute background check. I think that people should be educated first on the gun laws of their state, the things that are required to receive a shall-issue permit. So, you know, I have to go back and say that I did say I would urge states to consider that. I certainly did not say that I would make Vermont, or make any state for that matter, adopt that, but I still think it is a reasonable position to take. Yeah, and going back to the first point you made there, Sam, I'm sorry, I don't really understand the connection between the federal officials that were smuggling arms, or what was it that you were saying?
Well, it was more of a rhetorical connection that I made, so it's not really significant that I was talking about Arizona, but or the Arizona shootings.
Okay.
I was making the point that the gun laws that we have, that I think we should enforce, are not being enforced, which is the larger point to be made, that we don't need new ones, as you suggest.
Okay, so then let's take the case of what happened in Arizona, since that's
right,
what we seem to be discussing.
Okay, so talking about large clips.
Yep, we talked about large clips.
So the thing here isn't that we have large clips. So if I have a gun, it takes one bullet to kill a person. The large clip doesn't matter. If he wanted to kill those people, he would have been able to do it either way.
Yep,
essentially, this is what he's advocating is the system that was used in Britain and Australia to systematically disarm the population and to essentially take away their right to bear arms.
That's where I'm going to jump in.
No, because you've been talking the whole time, so I think it's time for me to talk. I think people here want to hear the facts, not the distortion. So this is what the left does: is they go out there and once something happens, they say, large clips. Oh, someone just got shot with a large clip. Let's ban all large clips. This was happening with semi-automatic rifles in the 90s. It was happening with Glock 9s. Plastic pistols back in the 90s as well. And this is what happens is they take advantage of these situations. Like Rahm Emanuel says, never let a great crisis go unused. And what they're trying to do is ban large clips because it's a chance to ban something. Not because large clips cause a lot more murders, because there's no evidence to indicate that. Criminals overwhelmingly do not prefer a single type of firearm. They just want to ban large clips as part of a comprehensive plan to disarm the American people and to violate their Second Amendment rights.
I'd just like to say, wow, there's so many things I'd like to get to.
Well, good.
Wow, okay. So, Sam, first of all, you said that this is part of a systematic effort of the left to disarm the populace, which I think is a completely ridiculous argument. The fact that you could even say that, you know, it's actually part of a larger narrative that the Republican Party has been pushing, that this idea that by banning these high magazine clips is some grand scheme of the left to disarm the populace, and then what's going to happen then? People are going to come with badges into your homes and shove you in the back of vans or something?
That's what they did in Australia and Great Britain, so yes.
I just think that is an absolutely ridiculous assertion. I think it fits along with this narrative, as I was saying, that conservatives have been pushing, that the Republican Party has been pushing, that is that we should hate our government, that our government is evil, that we should seek to impede our government at every turn, because anytime we try to pass any kind of sensible legislation that wouldn't have allowed...
Excuse me. My argument.
No,
my argument is that we should enforce our gun laws that we already have on the books. I think that we have fantastic gun laws that we need background checks. The permits are good and the training is good. I believe all these things which are enshrined in current gun laws.
So Sam,
I want to enforce. How do I hate my government?
So
I hate them for not enforcing it.
Let's do 7 minutes for questions.
Feel free to raise your hands.
Yeah, I mean, sure. What I was going to say was, in response to what Sam was suggesting, that every time something like this happens, even though there have been several incidents of this happening since that federal law expired in 2004, we've had several incidents where there have been mass shootings. The shooters normally carry these high magazine clips because they can fire off a clip and no one is going to attempt to disarm them while they're in the act of shooting. So, and that's exactly what happened in Arizona. Jared Lardner was firing his gun. He had fired off 30 or 31 rounds. It jammed, and then the only opportunity that someone had to stop him from shooting was by tackling and subduing him.
So, in a nation where there are 100 million guns, we should choose to ban and comprehensively ban a certain type of those guns because one thing happened once somewhere. That doesn't really make sense, does it? We can't govern by singular events, can we?
No, I mean,
because if we look at what happens in real life,
one thing didn't happen somewhere. The same thing happened at the University of Virginia Tech.
Great, fantastic example. Because the thing about the University of Virginia,
it's going to bring up a good discussion. The university is a good example.
Virginia Tech University is a gun-free zone, as was Fort Hood in Texas. And the idea of that is that you can't carry a gun there. They think that's going to reduce gun crime. But that means no one has guns, which is why at Virginia Tech and at Fort Hood, an Army installation, no one else was armed and able to stop the violence. So I think that's a great example. You brought that up of why people should be armed. Or can be.
You know, oh my goodness.
I believe that a Democrat used one example, one statistic to fight his own side of the argument, but when you were discussing the example regarding Vermont, are there any other, like maybe more examples of states with greater populations or greater variance in economic situations than Vermont? It seems like it's also one example and it's a very isolated situation.
Vermont, the thing with Vermont is it's actually a singular example of that gun policy because the rest of the nation doesn't have it. So all 49 states have different policies. So there aren't other examples of it. But Vermont is a state with a population of about 500,000 or over 500,000 people, and it's quite a large state. So I think that we can, well, not large, but significant. It's enough for us to draw certain conclusions from, certainly. And the statistics for that from the FBI.
But it's 500,000 people? In the whole state?
600,000. But if you look at D.C., the population is also somewhat low, and gun crime's massive there, with 13 deaths per 100,000 people from gun crime.
Hi. One of the concerns I have about gun ownership is sort of the stigma of the gun owner. Now, I am a gun owner, so I have to feel like there's this image of like these guys are just like big and muscular and just like they just love shooting things. Like, how do we in this country address the idea of, as Chris put it, gun control, or as Sam put it, laxer gun laws, without getting into this sort of stigma of like the gun owner is this big, bad, evil guy?
So, you know, I really wasn't expecting that question. You know, I have to say, I don't know. I don't really experience or see that. I mean, I'm not a gun owner myself, but I kind of feel like there isn't this idea of the gun owner in this country as a bad person. I think actually we have a culture that is pretty supportive of gun ownership. We have a culture that is pretty gung-ho on gun ownership, and I think it's usually something that is that's lionized rather than.
Agree with that assessment. I think that there is somewhat of a stigmatization of gun owners, and the best way to combat that is to be a gun owner and be a responsible gun owner and show people what it really means to be a gun owner, which is a person who cares about the safety of himself and his family. And that's what we need to get out there, and only by people being public about what they're doing and saying, this is why I do this and I'm responsible, that's how we can cure that.
Oh, can I just add something onto that?
Let's get a couple of questions.
Yeah, I'd like to follow up on the point Sam made, which was that in Australia and in Europe, they've started this trend of, you know, it was registration and then confiscation, or they go after high-cap magazines, and it's just a slow process towards eventually disarming the people, just as they did in Europe. And with the high-capacity magazines, I'd like to make a very real point about if you live on the border with Mexico, and you've seen the chaos, and you've seen that the failure of the federal government to enforce the border has led to private citizens basically combating drug cartels. And it's very real. There's been kidnappings, and there's been unbelievable, you know, crimes. If you know people down there, if you follow the media over the last few years, it's really out of control. And the private citizens are being confronted now with militia, you know, type weapons and kidnapping. They need to have high-capacity magazines. And it's a necessity, I think, that you should acknowledge.
Okay, so going to your first point with what happened in Australia, I think you said, and somewhere else?
And yeah, in Great Britain.
And in Great Britain. You know, I just don't think it's really a valid comparison to the United States because, like I said, I mean, gun ownership is overwhelmingly something that is supported in this country. Like I said, it has cultural significance in this country, it has historical significance in this country, and that obviously dates back to the Revolutionary War. And going to the second point you make about people on the border of Texas and Mexico, and they're being confronted by the Mexican drug cartels, should they have high magazine clips? I mean, that seems like a pretty extreme situation. I don't know. I mean, I'm not saying.
Well, I think that a point should be made as far as the gun laws in Australia and Great Britain, and he said that the attitude there about guns wasn't the same. Well, our attitudes on firearms were adopted specifically from the British when you're here, and the Australians much the same way. And if you look at the attitudes towards firearms in the English countryside, for example, you'd see they're quite similar to our own, where owning a firearm, or in this case, a rifle only at this point, the attitude's quite similar. And we can look at, if you look at it typically as far as moving and establishing liberal policies, Great Britain has been about 30, 40 years ahead of us. So I think it's actually a very apt comparison to make. And large capacity clips, I absolutely agree with you. If I live on the Mexican border, I'd want one too. So.
Let's do 1 minute.
Well, I think I made my point pretty clear that as an American, first of all, you have a legal right to own a firearm, and that under many circumstances you should want to own one, for whether it's for sport or defense or for collecting, and that you should exercise that right. That people who own firearms statistically have less assaults committed against them, their families are not robbed, murder rates are lower against them. Communities in which firearms are more allowed to legally owned have lower gun crime rates. This can be seen in the District of Columbia, which has the highest gun crime rate in the country, which is going down since handguns were legalized. There's no statistic that he's presented no statistics that indicate that gun bans or increasing bans on guns of any kind, handguns or otherwise, statistically combats gun violence or other violence. So I see no reason why we should change our policies whatsoever, instead of enforcing the ones we already have that are good laws. You know, well, first I'd just like to say that Sam clearly was expecting me to say something, and then when I didn't say that I was for these very, very harsh bans on guns, he just kind of kept pushing that on me as though that were what I was actually saying, and it wasn't. So now I'll continue with what I had planned to say to close. You know, I think that gun policy
is an issue that is frequently exciting and dividing people, and it's one that, whatever the topic is about gun policy, it's always changing because guns themselves are always changing. They're always gaining new parts or new methods of firing, new sizes, new appearances, and I think in response to that, most people would agree that we as a country need to be developing legislation that seeks some sort of compromise, legislation that maintains the right of a citizen to keep and bear arms, but that also demonstrates versatility in adapting to a new world with new and increasingly efficient and deadly weaponry. The simple truth is this: if we can't talk sensibly now about high-capacity magazine clips, which we clearly can, that allow a shooter to unload 30 rounds in the course of a few seconds, what are we going to be doing in 50 years? Can you imagine what kind of guns we'll be looking at then?
So right now we'll discuss illegal immigration. Illegal immigration is a very charged topic. How should the major parties deal with the 20 million illegals who are in the country? And what should the immigration policy of the United States be going forward? We'll start with the Democrat, Kevin Price, and then we'll go to the Republican, John Mantio.
First, to prevent this from devolving into a very contentious situation, I'd like to establish some common ground between both sides. I think we can both say that America can continue to embrace legal immigration and that we need to combat the continuous flows of illegal immigrants coming into this country. The last time we tried to tackle this issue, when Ronald Reagan granted amnesty to 3 million illegals in 1986, we failed to secure the border. We can't fail to do that this time. However, there is an important question of what to do with the border, what the Border Patrol estimates to be between 12 and 15 million undocumented immigrants in this country now. Those on the right have had their say. Alabama passed what are the toughest in the nation immigration laws. They require police to check papers on even routine traffic stops. And what have they wound up with? Farmers who have no workers to pick crops rotting on the vines. Same problem is occurring in Georgia right now. This approach is ineffective for both businesses and for citizens. So what do we do? What we need to do is pass the DREAM Act, which would allow somewhere between 1 and 2 million hardworking young men and women to obtain legal status in this country, and if they preserve it, have a pathway to citizenship. America is their home, and it would create between $1.4 trillion and $3.6 trillion in taxable revenue over the next 4 decades. It's a win-win situation. Rather than a costly deportation program that will put taxpayers in the lurch, we need to look for creative solutions to the problem that would require immigrants to learn English, pay a fine, and become or continue to be productive members of our society on a pathway to citizenship.
Good job. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Tampino. Thank you all for coming. The most recent numbers estimate there are some 12 million, as we've said, illegal immigrants in the United States. About 70% come from Mexico and Central America, and the rest come from the rest of the world, Europe, and primarily Asia. The burden these illegals push upon state and local governments are really hard to overstate. In Texas, illegal immigration accounts for about $16.4 billion in annual cost, which is about Texas's annual budget deficit. The same can be said for Texas, California, and many other states, especially those on the border. The fact that so many people want to come here, however, and are willing to break the laws to cross our border and live and work in this country is a testament to the success of our nation and to the great value of the freedoms that we all take for granted. However, the fact that so many people are able to come here and break our laws also speaks to the failure of the federal government to adequately enforce our borders, protect our national security, and enforce and ensure the financial health of our states. The immigration policy of the United States needs to have two facets. One which stems the tide of the illegal immigrants crossing the border, and another which ensures the incentives which draw those workers here are gradually phased out. The lawlessness at our Mexico border is a disgrace, and at least 70% of illegals who cross the border from our country come through our southern border. So it's prudent to start here when thinking about how to stem this tide. By committing more Border Patrol agents as well as using drone aircraft and virtual fencing, we can better locate and detain those who enter our country illegally. This is a pretty simple step, and Kevin mentioned we both pretty much agree on this. The second step, which will take more work, is removing the incentives which bring these immigrants across our border. A nationwide e-verify system which checks the eligibility of workers before he is hired will go a long way to reducing the employment which attracts illegals. This will be enforced through heavy fines on employers who employ illegals. And there's also, but to also allow for the economic growth, which, as Kevin mentioned, in Alabama and Georgia is critical, we also need to have a guest and day worker program, which allows these people to come across, work, and then go home, or stay for a certain amount of time. Yeah, I mean, we can go into it, whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. John, I certainly agree with you that the federal government has failed in its right to secure the border and to prevent illegal immigration, and it's caused states to act on their own. Both Rick Perry's Texas and California have passed their own versions of the DREAM Act that have been working for those states. However, national Republicans blocked such legislation in the Senate. Would you support something like that?
Well, no, I don't think that it's right to give, the DREAM Act was a largely amnesty bill. I don't think that's right to give people who came here illegally automatic amnesty. There's tons of people who wait in line, who desperately want to come here, especially from India and other places, who desperately want to come here but aren't allowed to because, you know, we only let in so many immigrants a year. That's not fair. You can't just grant these people who broke the laws, like essentially give them a shortcut. That's not right. So there has to be a certain sense of fairness, which is what you don't normally hear. That's not a word you normally hear our side using. Because it's become a buzzword and all that stuff. It has. So I don't really think that the DREAM Act is the answer. You know, I think that if we had a nationwide e-verify system, if we could get a real guest worker program, and if we could, for God's sake, secure the border, you know, that would do so much. I mean, you think about the crime that goes down at our border. You know, every day you hear about people crossing, people getting shot by illegals, and they go back across the border. You know, there's stories of people in Arizona getting shot at from across the border, and the Border Patrol agents can't do anything about it. That's wrong, and that needs to stop.
I certainly agree with you, John, on that point. There's a lot of agreement here. I think it's interesting that
I could take a super hard line.
Yeah, and I probably could as well. But I think it shows that in this country there is a lot of common ground, and that we're just missing it. As part of the DREAM Act legislation is put before the U.S. Senate in 2010, actually, Harry did add a nationwide e-verify program to that. E-verify was also part of the 2007 comprehensive bill that President Bush supported and that was filibustered in the Senate. Didn't receive an up or down vote, despite the fact that it would have had the votes to pass. I think was a tragic failure on the federal government's part to comprehensively reform immigration, and a testament to Congress's failures over the last half decade on this issue. Those of you that don't know what E-Verify is, and something I think John and I both support, is that it's a nationwide employer check system to make sure that employers are using legal workers, those who are legally in this country, for their work. And I agree that Democrats also want to end the incentives for people to come to this country illegally, because corporations are simply taking advantage of these undocumented workers, and it's helping bring the flow instead of stemming it.
And when you subsidize through your tax dollars, that's really like the crux. I mean, it wouldn't really matter if it didn't cost so much. Like really, like there's libertarian points of view where it's like, hell, have open borders, but when you have a large entitlement system, you can't have that. You know, you can't have all this free education going to people who aren't paying into the system. You can't have all this free health care. You can't be paying for all these prisons for people who aren't in the system. It's just not working. You know, California is very, very close to insolvency right now, and over 2/3 of their budget deficit could be accounted for under the cost that they spend on illegals. You know, so that's really the crux of the matter, is the incredible costs that are being incurred on our country and states and local governments.
See, that's where I think like something like the DREAM Act would help, as well as a guest worker program. The illegals that aren't paying taxes into the system are those that are not being able to work in a documented fashion. A lot of illegal immigrants that do work for corporations do, in fact, pay taxes. They have an individual tax number, as opposed to a Social Security number that does allow them to pay into the system. However, if we allow these people to come out of the shadows and really pay into the system on both sides of the equation, not just the employer side, but on the individual side, I think that would help alleviate a lot of those budget issues.
But I mean, to your point though, I think the big issue was the DREAM Act. With the DREAM Act was the amnesty for the people who were breaking the law. I mean, they are illegal immigrants. They're inherently not obeying the law. So it did not make sense, I think, at the time. It was in 2006.
That was
Or-
President Bush's
Yeah.
comprehensive.
Yeah, it didn't
immigration.
make sense to those on the right to say, hey, how can we reward essentially these people for having broken the law? I understand they're here, but at the same time, that you need to treat the people who are in the line in a fair and right way.
And
Let's take some questions.
Yes. Oh,
That was a lot more mundane than I was going to be. So let me bring up something that isn't always agreed upon. Sanctuary cities. A lot of Democratic-leaning cities, or heavily leaning cities like San Francisco, have basically been, now Boston's proposing it, has basically turned a blind eye to illegals within their city, hence sanctuary cities. What are both your thoughts?
do you mind if I take that first? I think it speaks to a point that both of us made. It's a failure of the federal government that's being hoisted upon the shoulders of state and local governments. They simply can't afford to police for illegal immigrants. That's the job of the federal government. That's something that
Okay, but local.
the federal government needs to do.
Like, how about should the cities? Is that appropriate steps for? Is that appropriate for a city to do?
I think that's what they need to do, unfortunately. It is an unfortunate situation, but in this broken system, I think they're not left with much of a choice, much like states that have to pay out these entitlements to illegal immigrants are stuck to do. Many local governments, especially in California, like you mentioned, can't even police marijuana laws, let alone immigration laws. It's simply incredibly expensive, and I don't think that it's something that can be resolved at the local level.
I just don't think that having a sanctuary city would make sense in any way for a city to have. I mean, I understand that people in California, specifically San Francisco, and probably San Diego, probably like it. Nora from San Francisco. But, I mean, the cost that that's foisting upon their state government is just unbelievable. I don't know what the numbers are for illegals in San Francisco, but they're incredibly high, I'm sure.
As much as those costs are, the cost of weeding out these illegal immigrants by local and state police forces is even greater than the entitlement.
Any verified system would go a long way to relieving that cost.
That's a good point, Joe.
Oh, pro. Not right. Not really. I'm going to stop.
To curb illegal immigration, what are your thoughts about possibly reforming the process of getting either green cards, work permits, or student visas? Because it seems like a lot of illegals are crossing into this country because it's easier to do that than to go through the bureaucratic system of getting like a legal visa. So how would you guys reform the process of legal work visas and legal student visas and keeping them in this country to work and pay taxes and be
You're 100%
prosperous?
right. I mean, if you talk to anybody who works in business, you talk to any CEO, there's a brain drain. They want these workers from India, they want these workers from China who are really motivated, smart engineers, computer people. They want them to come here. But getting those H1B, F, whatever the visa is, I can't remember. Because I got H1N1 visas and green cards is really, really difficult. So that is a very valid point, and many people on the right, especially in the Chamber of Commerce, are urging Congress to make that easier. Because it's better for business. They have smarter people.
Yeah, I think it's a testament to the fact that people still want to come to America. They want to study in our universities. They want to work for our corporations. We do attract the world's greatest minds, and I don't think that's something the federal government should ignore. They need to make it easier for those people to come here. And when we say that, we need to address the undocumented workers and the undocumented immigrants in our country right now, we're not saying they need to be put to the front of the line ahead of those people. We simply need to push them to the back of the line. They can pay a fine, learn English, become productive members of this society, and certainly in no way should they be given preference over those folks. And I think eliminating some of the hurdles in coming to this country to work or to study in a legal manner should be removed.
My faith in the federal government acting in an efficient way is rather low. So a system where 12 million people go to the back of a line where you enforce fines does not seem particularly, I would imagine they'd make that very, very bad. They'd make it very expensive.
I doubt it could be much worse than them trying to round up those 12 million illegals, separate families, and send them back to where they came from. It's like, if you were looking for a lot of fights, we have small disagreements.
I could do it.
All right. Rick Perry said if you don't give the children of legal immigrants college tuition benefits, then you have no heart. Do you have a heart?
I certainly have a heart. But I don't think it makes sense, especially if I'm a taxpayer in Texas, that I would ever support anything like that. That my tax dollars will be going to children of illegals does not seem right to me. I mean, I understand that they are disadvantaged because their parents probably don't make that much because they're migrant farmers or whatever. But to be honest with you, if I'm a taxpayer, that's not really my fault. So I don't think that that's right at all. I don't think it's heartless to say that people who aren't here legally should somehow not get the benefits of my state, which I pay into. I don't think that's heartless at all.
Problem is, a lot of these children were born here legally. A lot of them were brought over at very young ages. Essentially, this is the country that they know. They are Americans, and that's, I think, what the DREAM Act attempts to do. You can have these people in this country, educated, productive members of this society who are giving something back, or you can have them being blight on the system, who are continuing to take those entitlement payments, and that's a bigger cost to taxpayers. Something like what Rick Perry did in Texas, and I applaud him for it, something that a lot of us here in the Northeast lose sight of, but I know from where I'm from, back in Nevada, being near the border and having a large number of undocumented people, is that they grow up and they do become productive members of this society in a lot of cases. I think it's more beneficial to the taxpayers in the long run. It's an investment, not a reward.
Okay, so we're talking about the DREAM Act, and I'm just wondering, what makes the children who benefit from them, what makes them better and more deserving than anyone else? Like an American family who is here, who came here legally or just happened to be born here, like they might not have money, but they might have a smart student, so why can't financially it works for them, why are these people more deserving in the DREAM Act?
That's a great question, and they're not. Actually, what the DREAM Act does, it allows students who have gone to college or have served honorably in our military to get legal status in this country and have a pathway to citizenship. It doesn't confer upon them certain entitlements. It doesn't give them extra money for going to college. It simply rewards the hard work and sacrifice they've done for this country and allows them to stay here legally and allows the country to benefit from their hard work. I think that's a common misconception.
Why don't you give your one-minute closing statement first?
As you've seen, unfortunately not the most exciting debate in terms of entertainment, but I think it is
cordial, for sure.
Cordial, and I think very encouraging that there is a lot of common ground off of which we can work, a lot more than you would get from the tenor of national debates over this country. Me agreeing with George W. Bush and John agreeing with a lot of congressional Democrats is something you won't see a lot of. But I think there's two approaches we can take to this issue. We can continue to look forward, or we can look backward. We can try and round up people that are already here, a lot of whom have families, a lot of whom have children who are citizens of this country, and cause a lot of headaches that way. Or we can secure the border, keep this problem from happening again, and establish those people as productive members of our society now. Allow a pathway to citizenship, they pay a fine, they learn English, they go to the back of the line. Don't reward them, but integrate them into our society in a way that makes sense.
Yeah, I think the first step has to be securing the border. We've been talking about it for 20-something years, almost 30 years now, and really nothing has happened. So I guess to close, what I'm going to say is that has to be the first step. You can do all the internal stuff that you want. We can talk about all different acts that Congress wants to pass or whatever. But if that border is still 1,000 miles of open territory, nothing's going to matter. So I think that the Republican Party, most of the candidates right now are arguing, or have argued in the most recent CNN debate, the focus has been primarily on how are we going to get a border. Partial fence, partial drones, a lot more Border Patrol agents. That would do a huge amount, to further the discussion. Because until that border is secure, really all we're discussing here afterwards is moving. Thanks.
next our discussion will be about entitlement reform. We'll start with Republican John Anastransky, and then we'll go to Claudine Murphy for the Democrats. What is the best way to save the big three entitlements, Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security? Could partial privatization help ensure their future solvency?
I only have 90 seconds, so let's get right into the mock. In 15 years, thanks to our baby boomer friends, Social Security will begin running a deficit. It will be objectively unable to pay out benefits to those elderly people who rely upon it. Here's our proposal. Taxpayers should be able to divert half their share of the payroll tax at 6.2% to private savings accounts. These people would forfeit future Social Security benefits by their own choice. They would also receive bonds containing the value of their lifetime-to-date benefits. Next in line is Medicare. Again, in a few decades, our beloved baby boomers are about to give us an $80 trillion budgetary shortfall. So let's do two things. First, let's means test. Let's make beneficiaries who earn more pay more. Second, let's stop dictating to seniors what sort of care Medicare can and cannot cover. Let's issue a flat rate voucher on the basis of need that they can spend at their own discretion. Finally, we come to Medicaid. People are incentivized by states to enter the Medicaid program because Washington promises state governments $1 of federal spending for every dollar they spend on the program. States pull out teeth to get that extra dollar from the tooth fairy. So let's start by killing the matching fund system entirely. Block grant Medicaid funds entirely back to the states and let them spend it like grown-ups. In summation, let me say this. At the bottom, our proposal is not radical. Rather, it intends to introduce incremental reforms to allow for choice and as a result to ensure long-term solvency.
Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid are necessary. They are mandatory items of the budget for a reason. These programs are necessary to achieve a stable government, a stable economy, and in other words, a stable nation. Government is in place principally to protect the livelihoods of its citizens. Therefore, it must ensure its citizens' basic right to life by providing Social Security and health care. The federal government must be the body to ensure these rights because it alone has the resources to do so. The obligation of the federal government to protect these rights cannot be delegated to the states because not only do states not have the resources, but also social programs like these function better when they are regulated and inclusive. That is, when they are regulated by the federal government, the same across all state lines, and inclusive of all citizens of the country, not just of a single group or a single state. For the same reasons, these programs cannot be privatized, because they need to be inclusive of every citizen of the country. The more people you have paying into the system, the more efficiently the system functions. Furthermore, getting rid of these programs would be economically disastrous, because Social Security is keeping 40% of Americans 65 years old and over out of poverty. There is even more economic incentive to maintain these programs at the federal level as a federal responsibility, because a reformed and universal single-payer healthcare system, for example, would actually cost the government and the citizens less money, and it would offer much more coverage and security and be much more effective. We spend $553 billion on defense and only $12.5 billion on Social Security. I see a problem with spending $540 billion more on taking away lives than on helping to maintain them.
First of all, how much money did you just say we spend on Social Security?
12.5.
No, I think the recently proposed budget has $800 billion potentially being spent on Social Security, so I think that's a major distortion. This is the budget set forth by the Obama administration.
I'm sorry, I think what you're referring to is actually a combination of the entitlements of Social Security and Medicare together. Yeah.
If I may, the Obama budget, let me reel this off, approximately $800 billion for Social Security alone. Medicare, $468 billion. Medicaid, approximately $260 billion. Those are, if you looked at the budget put forth by the administration, those are the numbers. So now we can agree we want to ensure long-term solvency in these programs, right?
Yes.
We want to make sure that the best aspects of the programs are preserved.
Absolutely.
So under your plan, we seem to be making politics as a crow flies. We want to go in a straight and narrow path. We never want to at all take brief detour to make sure that the fundamentals of these programs are sound.
We want to make sure that these programs run as efficiently as possible.
Yeah,
So
right,
the federal government is running them efficiently and making these programs inclusive of all citizens. That's really what's best for the country.
Now, I'm not entirely sure that the federal government is running these efficiently. You have...
Well, reform, I agree reform needs to happen.
Well, what reform proposals do you have?
I think it should be reform at the federal level. I think less of the burden needs to fall to the states, because, like I've been saying over and over, I feel like a broken record, but really the more people you have in a system, the more socialized you make these systems, the better they're going to function. And we can see this by comparing how much, for example, U.S. citizens at an individual level and U.S. as a nation spends on healthcare, for example, than how much countries and citizens in Europe spend.
Okay. Now, I agree with you. We want people who are in the Social Security system to benefit from it, but it's been estimated that even in this harsh economic climate, if you were to invest in a private fund, it would pay out 2.8 times more than the government is able to. So how do you respond to that, for instance? It also seems that you haven't really proposed any reform measures. We're going to come up with an $80 trillion shortfall in Medicare, and the economy of the United States only produces about, what, $15 trillion, something like that? How can we possibly address this?
These are basic rights, though. The federal government, as I've said, cannot get rid of them.
We're not here to have a theoretical debate about rights, though. We're talking about long-term solvency. If you want to pursue that digression, I will. But then that's a philosophical debate. We're here to debate the long-term solvency of these programs, and you still have not proposed a single measure to ensure that solvency. I have.
Well, for example, we spend way more on defense, regardless of the statistics each of us are giving out. We do spend too much on defense and not enough on these social programs that help to maintain life rather than taking them away. So that would be my first step for tangible reform, if you want to go in that direction. I think that we do need to readjust our values, and we need to value life, and we need to ensure the success of these programs by financing them.
In the next budget proposed by the administration, the Department of Defense, for instance, is being granted something like $530 billion. That only accounts for about 5/8 of one...
553, actually.
Something, okay, I was reeling that out of the top of my head, sorry, thank you for correcting me, but that only accounts for about 5/8 of the amount of money going towards Social Security. It's just objectively not enough. I might agree with you that there's a lot of waste. The Pentagon actually agrees with you. Even Paul Ryan is looking to address that. But another thing is that this seems to me to be an evasion. You're saying, we're not going to reform these programs, we're going to cut spending elsewhere. It's just not enough.
Not only are we going to cut what we can from elsewhere, but we need to not be afraid to raise the revenue, because we can't fix this problem without revenue. No matter what you say, this is not solely a spending issue.
Well, from whom would that revenue come?
That revenue would come obviously from the citizens, but it would be delegated fairly. I'll take the extreme liberal stance and say that it would be based on ability to pay. So you pay into the system what you can, and you take what you need. That's how these systems function.
I agree if you're talking about means testing, but if you're talking about something like a millionaire's tax, the one proposed by Obama can only raise about $500 billion of revenue. Again, that only pays for basically Medicare. You can't address the problem in general by just raising taxes or by just cutting defense. You need to actually look at the programs themselves and try to reform them in particular.
How would you feel, I know a lot of people are proposing maybe having a cutoff for people who can get Social Security and Medicare. There are a lot of people that take advantage who are making a lot of money, but they'll still use Medicare and Social Security because why not? You're getting this money anyway, why not use it? So would you propose that the people that earn a lot of money and have saved a lot of money shouldn't be in the system? But they should have to pay into it, but shouldn't be able to get the funds from it?
Yeah, well, I would tend to say that the government's role is not to shower entitlements among people, it's to maintain a social safety net. The society in general will probably agree with me there. So no, I don't think somebody like Warren Buffett needs any Social Security benefits, if that's what you're asking.
I would actually agree with you there as well. I think that, as I said, you pay what you can into the system and you take what you need. And if you're one of those people DJ brings up who just doesn't need, then it's not fair for you to be taking away from the people that do.
Well, let's let people, yes.
How would you dictate who needs how much money and how much they should be putting in?
Well, as we do, right? So it's based on, well, we'll take welfare for an example because that's easy, but it has very strict regulations, which are based on income level, the size of your family, crisis situation, such as a medical emergency, unemployment, pregnancy, homelessness, etc. And then you have to be able to find work within 2 years. So those are just some standards that I would propose, that it would be definitely and foremost based on income.
We do have a broken system, so what changes would you propose to the system?
I would propose that the federal government readdress the system, so I think everybody can agree on that, and that they make sure, as DJ brings up, that nobody is taking advantage of the system, but also that everybody is included in the system, paying in, and then that only those people who need, based on income level, are accepting the benefits.
I wish I had this one. Because we would have disagreed a lot. When you quoted Marx, that was refreshing. But my big question is, like, you could tax $500 billion, like you said, you could raise revenue or whatever, and just take your money. Okay. And that'd be fine for like a year. Okay, fine. Okay, but in 10 years, there's a huge, like, have you ever seen the curves for the entitlements? It goes like this. It goes parabolic. The cost curve for all these entitlements is $186 trillion. GDP is $15 trillion. So the unfunded liability is something like $100 trillion. Now, I haven't heard you address in one specific stance how you're going to fix that cost curve. How you're going to, I mean, you could tax all the wealth in the country and it wouldn't be enough. So it's obvious that these programs, while we might like them, have to change. We simply cannot afford to have